Our next speaker is Dr. Ben Hurlbut. Dr. Hurlbut is Associate Professor of Biology and Society in the School of Life Sciences at Arizona State University. He studies the changing relationships between science, politics, and law in the governance of biomedical research and innovation in the current and previous centuries. Dr. Hurlbut has the enlightening ability to freely roam in between these usually self-referential domains of scientific, political, and philosophical mindsets. And this challenges assumptions that were often unquestioned. So consider yourselves warned. Thank you, Dr. Hurlbut.
Well, thank you very much for having me, and that's quite an introduction. So I don't know if I'll be able to live up to that, but I'll give it a shot. So I want to kind of broaden the aperture a bit and just put onto the table some larger questions that I have no answers to, but it strike me are at least necessary as a background for the rumination on the kinds of important, very, very practical and very important and very urgent questions that are the focus of today's meeting. And we've been discussing the trolley problem. I think we'll continue to discuss the trolley problem. And it seems to me a very important and valuable frame. And yet one thing I want to draw attention to is that the trolley problem focuses on a kind of a decision point, right? And the approach in discussing the trolley problem is to think, about the lever, about the moment of decision, and the kind of bifurcated possibilities associated with it, the sort of two distinct futures that each of the tracks represent. But what I want to draw attention to is the divergence, the two tracks, and to think about the ways in which those forms of divergence and presumptions about the kind of decisions that are appropriate to them figure in all sorts of different domains. And I think that one of the things that is clear that this pandemic has done is bring to the surface underlying, well, infrastructures of divergence, we might call them, in which some people are on one side of the track and others on the other, and the ways decisions are taken are highly structured in advance. So in other words, I want us to focus on the tracks, the lever, the kind of background conditions under which those moments of decision come to be. And this is, of course, the K-shaped recovery, the kind of economic trajectory that we seem to be on, in which the winners win and the people with less means end up bearing the costs. And of course, we're seeing another divergence in what the Director General of the World Health Organization has called vaccine apartheid, a divergence in what territories contain people who will be liberated from the condition of this pandemic and who will continue to bear the brunt of it. Here's, of course, a very familiar representation of the state of distribution of vaccine access in the present moment. And of course, this is a territorial representation. I mean, I think the borders matter in a way that we should pay attention to, particularly given the fact that a pandemic is pan in its very nature. In a sense, the disregard for borders is built into the problem. And yet territoriality is asserting itself in profound ways. And the means, the disparities associated with those forms of territoriality likewise are expressing themselves. But I think we can think about territoriality not just in terms of national borders, but also in terms of the forms of sovereignty, the claims that are laid to particular conditions of autonomy, of power, of control that we take as we take as for granted, we take as a kind of a given. And the sorts of divergences that those produce. I mean, there's one thing to note in this statement from Pfizer's chief executive is not just that the problem of vaccine development, distribution, and access is being seen as a location of profits, but also the way in which there's a kind of disjunction between the nature of the problem as I think we understand it as a sort of collective humanity, and the nature of the problem as it is understood as a corporate opportunity, you might say. So when we think about this point of decision, I think we ought not take for granted, well, certainly the location of the lever, and I think that RaDVaC and Preston in particular have problematized that in very productive ways, but also the existence of the tracks, the nature of the trolley, the ways in which decisions coalesce into particular moments. And I think we got to ask, how is it that these tracks got laid as they did? This is an image from the 19th century, a Granger, the Grange movement image, from the Grange movement, when the railroads were being built. You can see that the train said, well, you probably can't see, but it says usurpation, bribery, extortion, consolidation train. And it's, you know, running over the farmers whose land's being appropriated in order to lay the track. But what is getting laid here is not just train track, but a vision of progress, right? A vision of an infrastructure that will be transformative. And yet the people that are sacrificed in the name of that transformation are sort of lost to history, become invisible in the picture of progress, but nevertheless, in a sense, lie beneath the track. And so I think that one of the things that the conversations around intellectual property are doing are presenting before us a set of what has come to be kind of taken for granted infrastructure about the right way in which to do innovation, and presenting it to us as an expression of agency, as something that we choose, that we perpetuate, and we remain committed to. But one of the things that's been very interesting about this discussion around suspension of IP is the rejoinder that, well, the suspension of IP is insufficient in itself, and therefore it ought not be done. The challenges are actually infrastructural, in know-how, in production capacity, and so on and so forth. And suspending the IP will damage something very important that we rely on, while at the same time not solving the problem that it's meant to solve. And therefore, we should hold everything still, essentially as it is. But I think what it invites us to do is to pay attention to the tracks and to the ways in which those tracks were laid. And once those tracks are laid, we can imagine no alternative pathway. And yet the maintenance of the tracks is essential to their preservation. And so here's a statement from the Director General of the International Federation of Pharmaceutical Manufacturers and Associations. At a time when the focus should be on science and innovation, undoing the very system that supports it is dangerous and counterintuitive. Science and innovation come to be identical with a regime of intellectual property, a kind of infrastructure of incentivization, which then comes to be equated with the public good that that infrastructure is meant to produce. And yet, there is a need, a profound need. I think, though, we should take one step back from that profound need and think also about the representations of that profound need, what the have-nots need from the haves. And in the sort of representation of innovation and its coalescence into the hands of particular actors through the mechanism of intellectual property and the forms of concentrated know-how and infrastructure and capital that come along with it, is a sort of characterization of what good, who has a sort of monopoly on the good that the wider world needs and can supply to that world. And I'm putting this up just to point to the ways in which these are sort of discourses. These are ways of thinking about the necessary infrastructures that cut across all sorts of different domains of science and technology and authorize, in effect, the laying of the track and the occlusion of the sort of people who the train will run over. And more importantly, in a sense, or not more importantly, but equally importantly, the ways in which the kind of production of an incapacity to ask questions about that. So we're in the midst of a kind of a global challenge, and yet we have built the infrastructure which has produced these forms of divergence. And I want to take us back just very briefly to a moment about a little over a decade ago, when a country in a global South country, a developing country, namely Indonesia, began to withhold viral samples from the World Health Organization and the network. This is influenza virus. This was H5N1 from the sort of global sharing network that would take viral samples from places where potentially pandemic if viruses were present and put them into circulation for study and development of response. Indonesia began to withhold that virus out of concern that it was in effect being exploited by global capital for the patenting of and production of vaccine that when push came to shove in the event of a pandemic, Indonesia would have the last access to. And indeed, of course, that scenario is playing itself out presently. But there was a kind of wholesale rejection of the idea that you could have something called viral sovereignty, that you could lay claim to a virus as within a territorial space, because that virus is intrinsically not deferential to territoriality, it's intrinsically global. But here's the sort of rationale. This is from the Indonesian health minister of the moment. We want to change the global virus sharing mechanism to be fair, transparent, and equitable. What we mean by fair is that any virus sharing should be accompanied by benefits derived from the shared virus, and these benefits should be coming from the vaccine producing countries. What came out of this was a preparedness framework that, in a sense, globalized credit for scientific contributions, but did little, in effect did nothing, to change the infrastructures of response, which had in effect been privatized. Large coalescences of capital that are the infrastructures we should rely on, we think, to respond to the need for vaccine, are also infrastructures of self-interest and of profit. And so the best that this framework could do was was to ask member states to urge vaccine manufacturers that, in the event of a pandemic, they should take care of the poor people as well as the rich people. It's a different virus, but the scenario that Indonesia was worried about is presently playing out. Let me note that the globalization of science, in an odd way, has perpetuates itself. And I won't go into this, but it's a sort of bizarre thing that when questions about gain of function research emerged in 2011 and 2012, this settlement was in the background, the notion that there needed to be kind of global transparency. And that led to the publication of papers in which there was research that was of high concern vis-a-vis bioterrorism, but also in a sense a doubling down on a kind of authorization of global science to do what needs to be done in order to be prepared for pandemics, without asking more deep questions about what preparedness means anyway. And if there's anything to the hypothesis that SARS-CoV-2 came out of a gain of function experiment, well, this is actually in its direct genealogy. So we talk about incentivization, we talk about safety, that's the sort of warrant for clinical trials. We talk about those trials being ethical. It's about the sort of assessment and mitigation of risk, and they need to be well regulated. But actually, these are tracks. These are coalescences of deeper ideas about what the public good is, that form infrastructures that are the sort of grounding of a notion of what trustworthy technologies are, what trustworthiness in a process of innovation. Ethics has become more a matter of compliance. Risk is not about quantified forms of risk, narrowly construed. It's about securing life. It's the operationalization and constructions of risk. But we have to step back from those to ask questions about what forms of security are appropriate and what kinds of endangerments, as Nirael was talking about, what sorts of self-endangerments are appropriate in the name of securing life, especially of securing collective life. And those are questions of governance, not merely of regulation. The way we regulate ought to be subsidiary to larger questions of the politics of governance, of what the collective good is that gets built into these machineries that in effect become the mechanisms whereby the track is laid and the train travels upon, when in fact there's a wide open territory that we could travel across in any number of other ways. And we should remember that these are not new questions, that the design of clinical trials was, for example, a major focus of political protest, indeed directed at Tony Fauci himself, when the AIDS epidemic was raging through the gay community. And the questions that they managed to put on the table about the design of trials were not narrow technical questions about the design of trials, but about what visions of good science and its relationship to the protection of people should sit inside of the design of trials. What gets prioritized, knowledge or lives? And I point to this as a sort of expression of a politics of experiments in justice. RaDVaC, as I understand it, is in a sense an intervention in precisely that. There are questions about, what's the most efficient way to develop a vaccine, but just as importantly, there are questions about the ways in which those projects are undertaken in the name of the collective good, and how that collective good is understood and by whom. And so the title of my talk comes from an old song that was sung by Black laborers, some of them slaves in the South as they laid tracks in the 19th century. This is a picture of progress unfolding itself, the progress of the moment. And I think as we look back on this moment, we ought not, in fact, we clearly should not take for granted the vision of progress that was built into this infrastructure and the lives that it depended upon, in a sense, used up in the process of constituting itself. Rather, we should step back and question the foundational ideas about what sorts of infrastructures are right and appropriate, so that the trolley problem may be the right framework to ask about a particular decision point. But we should always remember that that decision point is itself the expression of prior decisions, many of which become normalized, become tacit, and cease to be the focus of question. Thank you very much.